This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's hard to find time in the day to take care of our mental health, isn't it? We've all got 1,000 things to do in a day, and most of the time there just isn't enough hours to do them all. The thought of taking time out of our busy days to drive across town to visit a therapist can just seem impossible. Luckily, BetterHelp is here to help. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't even have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. And thanks to the great people at BetterHelp, I have a special offer for Obscure History listeners. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/obscure. That's betterhelp.com/obscure. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this episode. Albert Einstein is one of the most important and well-known people in history. His genius is lauded through the generations. He once stated that he had no special talents and was only passionately curious. But what if he was wrong? What if Einstein did have a special talent? Many people believed that he did, and one of the ways that they attempted to prove this suspicion might leave you positively bewildered. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. Albert Einstein was born in Ulm in the German Empire in 1879. His father Hermann went into an electrical engineering business with his brother Jacob, which was great for a time. The family relocated to Munich to tap into a larger market, but no sooner that they had set up shop in the capital city, their business began to flounder. Unfortunately for the Einstein brothers, their factory specialized in parts using direct current, and Munich was moving toward alternating current. This disruption to the family business forced them to move around Europe for a time, primarily throughout Italy. The Einsteins eventually moved back to Munich, where young Albert would finish school. His father encouraged him to follow in his footsteps to become an electrical engineer. However, Albert clashed with the school he was attending. He resented their insistence that education should only be administered through rote memorization and cruel consequences. He managed to make it through primary school, and though he found their methodology loathsome, he did excel. By the age of 12, Albert Einstein had mastered Euclidean geometry. He also discovered an entirely unique proof for the Pythagorean theorem in that same year. At 13, he discovered the philosopher Immanuel Kant and developed a passion for understanding the human condition. In fact, Albert's tutor, Max Talmud, recalled, "At the time, he was still a child, only 13 years old, yet Kant's works, incomprehensible to ordinary mortals, seemed to be clear to him." At 14, he decided to dedicate himself to the study of geometry and formed a thesis that would follow him into adulthood: that the world could be understood through mathematical structure. That same year, he mastered integral and differential calculus. By 16, he was enrolled in the Swiss Federal Polytechnic Institute in Zurich. Surrounded by a half dozen of Europe's brightest and most innovative minds, Einstein began to thrive. He made fast friends with other notable geniuses like Marcel Grossmann and Michel Besso, who would go on to have an impressive careers in academia in their own rights. It was at the Polytechnic Institute that he met his first wife as well. After graduating in 1900, Einstein spent almost 2 years searching for a teaching post, but the search took too long, and with the help of his friend Marcel Grossmann, he was finally able to secure employment at the Swiss Patent Office. Though this job might have seemed like sort of a detour from his academic pursuits, it still satiated his chronic curiosity. Much of his work at the Patent Office related to questions about the transmission of electric signals and electrical mechanical synchronization of time, two technical problems that show up in his later work. Additionally, together with some of the friends he had made in Bern, Einstein started a small discussion group in 1902, which met regularly to discuss science and philosophy. After 4 years in the Patent Office, he finally broke into academia. On April 30th, 1905, Einstein completed his dissertation, A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions. After successfully defending his work, he was awarded a PhD. The following year, which has been called Einstein's Miracle Year, he published 4 groundbreaking papers on the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and the equivalence of mass and energy, which were to bring him to the notice of the academic world. He was only 26 at the time. In 1909, he was awarded an associate professor position at the University of Zurich in the Theoretical Physics Department. In 1911, he moved to Prague to accept a full professorship. During his time in Prague, he wrote 11 scientific works, 5 of them on radiation mathematics and the quantum theory of solids. In the spring of 1913, Einstein was enticed to move to Berlin with an offer that included membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences and a linked University of Berlin professorship, enabling him to concentrate exclusively on research. He continued his pursuits of complete scientific understanding through the 20s and 30s. In fact, his celebrity began to rise in those decades. He was awarded a Nobel Prize for Physics. He was widely regarded as one of the world's most bright and brilliant minds. However, while touring American universities in 1933, the tide of tyranny was rising in his mother country. In February and March of the same year, the Gestapo repeatedly raided his family's apartment in Berlin. He returned shortly to find his country twisted beyond recognition by the poisonous influence of Nazism. In fact, his cottage had been turned into a Hitler youth camp and his sailboat split into kindling. Einstein immediately fled Germany, and in his absence, his intellectual work was labeled as propaganda and was destroyed. One German magazine even included him in a list of enemies of the German regime with the phrase, "not yet hanged," offering a $5,000 bounty on his head. After bouncing around without a permanent home, Einstein would eventually end up in the United States for good. He continued his prolific work in the sciences, philosophy, and politics. Tragically, on April 17, 1955, Einstein experienced internal bleeding. He was rushed to the hospital still clutching a speech he had been writing. Einstein refused surgery, saying, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He died at the University Medical Center of Princeton at Plainsboro, early the next morning at the age of 76, having continued his work until the very end. Obviously, Einstein remains one of the most well-known figures in world history. He is, quite frankly, not a person that really fits the parameters of this show. However, there is a detail about Einstein that seems to be a bit more obscure. After his death, you see, something very mysterious happened to his body, and it would take a great deal of hard work and over 2 decades to solve the mystery. But before we get to that, we need to stop and pay the bills. If you would like to continue without ads, go ahead and click that subscribe button in Apple Podcasts. You'll get ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. This week, subscribers will get to hear about even more famous historical figures who had maybe some less than savory things happen to their bodies after they died. All right, hang tight. In about 90 seconds, we will be right back. Einstein had become something of a legend in his lifetime. He was one of the most well-known intellectuals of his day and beyond, and as such, people were very interested in what made him tick. Certainly, this man who had seen so much farther than those who came before him must have had some sort of biologic anomaly to explain it. The trouble began, as author Brian Burrell recalls, on the evening of April 17th, 1955, when the 76-year-old physicist was admitted to Princeton Hospital complaining of chest pains. He died early the next morning of a burst aortic aneurysm. As is in the cases of Carl Gauss and Walt Whitman, the issue of permission to perform an autopsy is clouded by subsequent testimony. In the shock and excitement of Einstein's final days, it seems as if his wishes were disregarded for greater interests. Primarily the desire to find out what made his brain so much better than everyone else's. Burrell continued, Thomas Harvey, the pathologist on call that evening, would later say, I just knew we had permission to do an autopsy, and I assumed that we were going to study the brain. As reporters soon discovered, Harvey did not have permission, nor did he have a legal right to remove and keep the brain for himself. When the fact came to light a few days later, Harvey managed to solicit a reluctant and retroactive blessing from Einstein's son, Hans Albert, with the now familiar stipulation that any investigation would be conducted solely in the interest of science and that any results would be published to reputable scientific journals. As if completely disregarding the wishes of the dead wasn't bad enough, Harvey decided to keep a little souvenir. The pathologist, who had absolutely no experience in the field of neurology, removed Einstein's brain and eyes. In a sort of morbid idolatry, the eyes were given to Einstein's optometrist, Henry Abrams, as a gift. News that Harvey had removed the brain spread quickly, and within months he was offered an ultimatum. Either surrender the brain to the authorities or lose his job. He was subsequently dismissed, and this is where Harvey's life begins to spiral. He had promised Einstein's family that he would only use the brain for scientific purposes, but he was not a neurologist and refused to let others study the brain for him. Not only had he defiled the corpse of one of the world's most famous thinkers and betrayed the wishes of his family, he began destroying his own life on behalf of his actions. Einstein's brain haunted Harvey like the thumping of Edgar Allan Poe's telltale heart. Burrell continues, After losing his job, Harvey took the brain to a Philadelphia hospital where a technician sectioned it into over 200 blocks and embedded the pieces into celloidin, using a variation of the Economo method. Harvey gave some of the pieces to Harry Zimmerman and placed the remainder in 2 formalin-filled jars, which he stored in the basement of his house in Princeton. Harvey's marriage soon fell apart, and he left Princeton in search of work. After his wife threatened to dispose of the brain, he returned to retrieve it and took it with him to the Midwest. For a time, he worked as a medical supervisor in a biological testing lab in Wichita, Kansas, keeping the brain in a cider box stashed under a beer cooler. He moved again to Weston, Missouri, and practiced medicine while trying to study the brain in his spare time, only to lose his medical license in 1988 after failing a 3-day competency exam. He then relocated to Lawrence, Kansas, took an assembly line job in a plastic extrusion factory, moved into a second-floor apartment next to a gas station, and befriended a neighbor, the beat poet William S. Burroughs. The two men routinely met for drinks on Burroughs' front porch. Harvey would tell stories about the brain, about cutting off chunks and sending it to researchers around the world. Burroughs, in turn, would boast to visitors that he could have a piece of Einstein any time he wanted. Most interesting of all is that during this time, some people knew that Harvey had the brain, but most people would have never known. Most people probably didn't even realize that it was missing. As Harvey continued to move to more and more remote parts of the country, the brain followed, forever preserved in jars, stashed around Harvey's apartments like some sort of contraband. In fact, it took the diligent work of journalist Stephen Levy and his chauffeur, Michael Paternity, to rediscover the mystery of Einstein's brain and its location in Harvey's apartment. In his memoir, Driving Mr. Albert, Michael Paternity recalls the first meeting that he and Levy shared with Harvey. He says, Harvey has stoked a fire in the basement, which is dank and dark, and I sit among crocheted rugs and genie bottles of brown glass, Ethiopian cookbooks, and macrame. It has taken me more than a year to find Harvey, and during that time I've had a dim, incoherent feeling, one that has increased in luminosity, that if I could somehow reach him and Einstein's brain, I might unravel their strange relationship, one that arcs across this century and America itself. And now, before the future arrives and the supercomputers of the world fritz out and we move to lunar colonies, before all of that hullabaloo, Harvey and I are finally sitting here together. That day, Harvey tells me the story he's told before to friends and family, and pilgrims, one that has made him an odd celebrity even in this age of odd celebrity. He tells it deliberately, assuming that I will be impressed by it as a testament to the rightness of his actions rather than as a cogent defense of them. You see, he says, I was just so fortunate to have been there that day, just so lucky. We conclude the visit by going out for sushi, and over the course of the conversation, he mentions a handful of people he hopes to see in America before he dies. Yes, sir, I'd really like to visit some folks, he said. They included a few neuroanatomists with whom his brain has some business, and some friends, and in Berkeley, Evelyn Einstein, Hans Albert's daughter, and the granddaughter of Albert. Harvey has wanted to meet her for many years. Although he doesn't say why, I think it might be trying to face down some lingering guilt, some late-in-life desire to resolve the past before his age grounds him permanently, and with his death, the brain falls into someone else's hands. Perhaps, too, he wants to make arrangements for someone to take over the brain, and Evelyn is going to be interviewed for the job. Whatever the reason, by the meal's end, doped up on the incessant tinkling in of piped-in harps, Harvey and I had somehow made an agreement to take a road trip. I will drive him to California, and then, one afternoon, soon before our departure, Harvey takes me to a secret location, one he asks me not to reveal for fear of thieves and rambunctious pilgrims, where he now keeps the brain. From a dark room, he retrieves a box that contains 2 glass jars full of Einstein's brain. After the autopsy, he had chopped it into nearly 200 pieces, from the size of a dime to that of a thick turkey neck, and since then, he has given nearly a third of it away to various people. He flashes the jar before me, but only for a second, and then retreats quickly with them. The brain pieces float in a murky formaldehyde, leaving an impression of very chunky chicken soup. But it happens so quickly, Harvey so suddenly absconds with the brain, that I have no real idea what I've seen. And with that, the trio set off for California. They made a cross-country road trip out of the ordeal that ended in Princeton, the place where the entire mess had begun. After a lifetime of secret-keeping and hiding, Einstein's brain was finally back in the hands of certified professionals that could go about the business of studying it properly. Multiple research groups were formed to conduct as many tests as possible to try and understand the power of Einstein's intellect. Unfortunately, the results were less than desirable. The methods that they used were disputed. The studies were largely invalidated by the crude means of preservation Harvey had subjected it to. In fact, it wasn't until recently that scientists were able to make real progress in understanding how Einstein's brain worked at all. And ironically, this was accomplished with no advanced technology. By simply studying photographs of the brain that Harvey had taken before he cut it into small pieces, Dean Falk of Florida State University was able to note that, although the overall size and asymmetrical shape of Einstein's brain were normal, there were many sections of his brain that were not. There was a 4th ridge, apart from the 3 that normal people have, in Einstein's midfrontal lobe, involved in making plans and working memory. The parietal lobes were markedly asymmetrical, and a feature in Einstein's primary motor cortex may have been associated with his musical ability. Further studies also found that the connective fiber in Einstein's brain was stronger than most, which could have contributed to better communication between hemispheres. However, there are many who argue that these studies are untrustworthy by nature. Perhaps since Einstein is one of the most highly regarded people in the scientific community, scientific publications may have an innate bias in favor of the legendary thinker. Ultimately, the data has been inconclusive, or rather, heavily disputed. The tragedy is that in the end, Albert Einstein's corpse was defiled and his family betrayed, all for naught. At best, some speculative studies and the enjoyment of an eccentric pathologist. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I sincerely appreciate it so much. If you would like to have ad-free episodes, go ahead and push that subscribe button on Apple Podcasts. You'll get ad-free episodes and bonus content here at the end. Last week, I gave you kind of a demonstration of what that would be like. I left the subscriber content in the regular episode. That way you could get kind of a taste for it. As I mentioned here in the middle of this episode, the subscribers are currently listening to me blind react to a list of other famous historical figures who had their body parts taken after they died. I can only imagine that it's a wonderful time, because I know a couple of those off the top of my head, and they're pretty insane stories. So, as always, check out Greg at Indie Drop-In Network and Ariel at Earbuds Podcast Collective. They are two of the best people in the business, and they will help you find your next second favorite show. For now, I have got to get out of here. I've got many, many things to do tonight, and it is getting rather late. If you'd like to reach out, you can do so on Twitter at AllThePeoplePod, on Instagram at ObscureHistoryPod, or you can reach out on the email at obscurehistorypod@gmail.com. Thank you. Love hearing from you. Please reach out anytime. Questions, complaints, maybe you've caught me in some sort of error or lie. That would be exciting too. I will see you next week. Thank you.